You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Polly Mackenzie, Chief Executive of the Demos think tank, and PR Consultant Alex Deane. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the FT leads on the Tories' shock by-election defeat in Chesham and Amersham, with Conservative MPs blaming it on toxic planning reforms. That story also makes the front of The Guardian as senior Conservatives are reportedly warning the Prime Minister that a swathe of blue wall seats across the south of England could be at risk. The Yorkshire Post reports that northern political leaders are urging the Prime Minister to address a huge gulf between his levelling up ambitions and reality. And so we're joined tonight by Polly Mackenzie and Alex Deane. Good evening to you both. Let's start off, first of all, with The Guardian. We just, first of all, have to say that actually the papers aren't coming in because, obviously, because of the football, much delayed because they want to get that story into the editions. But the ones that we have got in, we'll take viewers through those. So we'll start with The Guardian and their headline there, Tories fearing a blue wall seats at risk after Lib Dem victory. Are they really in fear? Alex, would you say?
When you lose a seat like this with 16,000 vote majority, you should take note of it. And I think people trying to write off a defeat and suggest that it's, down purely to local factors, or that, turnout was down 20,000, which is true. These are excuses. You do have to look at this seriously. But I must say, governments normally lose by-elections, and that's of late not been the case, but that's absolutely the historical norm. Again, these are excuses. I don't think it's a good result for anyone, to be honest. I think plainly it's not a good result for the Conservative Party. It's a disastrous result for the Labour Party, their worst by-election result ever, now has some muttering about leadership challenge. And I don't think it's a good way for the Lib Dems to win an election either, campaigning against a progressive Liberal policy of more house building and more homes for younger and less well-off people. So I think in the medium term, it's bad for them too. It's a plague upon all their houses by-election for me.
Isn't winning the aim? Is there a bad way to win, Alex?
I think it's a really grotty way to win.
Oh, Polly, what say you?
All the political parties end up being pretty ruthless when it comes to ground campaigning. I once stood for council election and leaflets went out saying that I had stolen a council house, which was, I'd like to stress, not true. The Liberal Democrats have often been accused of sort of saying one thing, one place, saying anything to get elected, but they've also been on the receiving end of vicious attacks by the other parties about being kind of soft on crime or all sorts of things, So in the end, it is about winning. It's a surprising and yet impressive victory for the Liberal Democrats. But I do share Alex's concern about just the scepticism about planning reform, about house building that is held across older people, across homeowners. And traditionally, the Conservative Party has been the supporters, the champions of those people against the interests of renters, of people who don't own their home. They have persistently used policies that are about basically supporting the housing market more, propping up our kind of Ponzi scheme house price inflation. And liberalising that is one of the best things I think that this government is doing. And I remain one of the, of HS2. So I do share some of the sadness about what the people of Chesham and Amersham have in part voted for, which is to just shut down reform, growth and house building. But I think there is more to it than that. There's also just the question of whether the Conservatives can hold together this coalition or their new voters in the north. One of the fascinating things was Liberal Democrats sort of playing the nobody talks about us, we've been left behind narrative, which the Conservatives have played so effectively in the north, back at those voters who hear the Conservatives talking north all the time and a bit like, hello, you've forgotten about me.
Alex, you wanted to come in there.
Well, I was just going to say, this is the Conservative Party's most liberal policy, the housing policy that the government has. And for the Lib Dems to win an election opposing that, rather than taking a, no pun intended, more constructive approach on it, I think does mean that it's rather difficult for Ed Davey. I think he may live to regret that silly photo stunt, knocking down a blue wall with his yellow hammer. I think if you can't afford to buy a home, and a gleeful Lib Dem leader who gets elected with the vivid symbolism of him bashing down a wall might come back to haunt him. But I also think, I mean, bear in mind, they support that policy nationally, but oppose it locally. So, you know, to Polly saying sometimes the Liberal Democrats are accused of saying something one level and then another thing at another level. They did in this election. But they also support HS2 nationally, which is apparently a progressive and green policy, which they endorse at the national stage, but absolutely oppose and say is terrible and a Tory sellout at the local level. So it's a very bad way, I think, to win an election. That's why I used the term that I used that you were surprised by, Gillian, because I do think it's a bad way to go out winning a by-election. But fair dues to Polly. If you think the only thing that matters really is winning, it is no doubt an impressive victory and a big turnaround in what was a safe Tory seat. Chapeau.
And Polly, how much credence is there to the view that it really was a protest vote, particularly in terms of HS2?
I think all of these things are complicated. But just to be clear, I think I agreed with Alex about the importance of liberal planning reform. I'm a massive fan of house building. I remember when I worked in government, writing endless papers trying to get us up to house building numbers of 300,000, which now is Conservative policy. And I absolutely welcome. I'm not sure about this, the supporting it nationally point. I remember Ed Davey, I think in his first PMQs, criticising the planning policies. It was already going to be difficult to get those planning policies through Parliament. There was already talk of a Conservative rebellion from the Shire seats against the algorithmic decision-making around how many homes ought to be built. Because if you build a lot of homes, prices will inevitably, it's the law of economics, supply and demand, prices will stop rising or they even fall a tiny bit so that wages can catch up. And wouldn't that be glorious for the country, but of course not for homeowners? And so it was controversial already. I think the chance of those reforms getting through now have been struck an enormous blow. I think it's really sad.
Let's move on to the FT, Alex, and they're really coming from the point of view that the reforms are toxic. They're looking at it through that sort of prism, and also in the FT saying that the blue wall is vulnerable.
Yeah, and this is the part of the response we've seen from some people briefing the media from within government, that the planning reforms that the government has proposed are to blame, or at least an inability to properly explain them and put them well to the electorate. You will find after every election that a political party says, we had brilliant policies, we just didn't explain them very well. If only our comms had been better, then we would have won this election. And that's normally what's said, even after you've put to the electorate something that the electorate plainly really hated and you've gone backwards, like the so-called dementia tax that the Conservative Party offered to the electorate, or the tax rising hike agenda of the 1970s and 80s under Labour. Normally people say, well, it's just we didn't communicate it well enough. But I think this goes a bit further. I think Polly is right. I think that the policy itself is probably in jeopardy. That may seem to be a remarkable thing after a single by-election, but there will be many people sitting in seats that are a bit like Chesham and Amersham, where the real threat they face, the number 2 party is the Liberal Democrats, and they will think to themselves, well, if it can happen there with a 16,000 vote majority, it can happen in my patch too. And the other thing I think that's worth bearing in mind with that is who it squeezes out, because you've got the Labour Party increasingly being squeezed out by the Conservatives in the north, and the Labour Party being squeezed out increasingly in the south by the Liberal Democrats and other leftist parties. And so on the big issues of the day now, some of the arguments are being had not between Starmer and Johnson, the big debates of the day being had between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party. That's a very ugly place for the Labour Party, the opposition, to be in.
Polly, is it a blip in terms of the Liberal Democrats? Because, you know, many people, commentators, have been saying that Ed Davey has been speaking up this victory. It's not the end of conservatism in areas, as we've seen in Amersham, and he hasn't broken any blue wall. And as Alex was saying earlier, that he might come to regret that stunt with his yellow hammer.
I don't think that's true. I mean, most political photo ops and stunts are kind of cringy and embarrassing, and this was no exception. But I think the challenge for the Liberal Democrats is what is their political strategy within the party, within the policy framework that they vote through democratically. They're very progressive. I saw, you know, Liberal Democrat activists talking about how if this election was translated to everywhere, they'd have a majority. Wouldn't that be amazing? Because then they'd be able to abolish welfare sanctions, introduce universal basic income, have massive redistribution, and all sorts of things that actually would be probably not what the people of Chesham and Amersham have voted for. And yet there is clearly a group of people, the more affluent people, small c Conservative, in these Tory shires, in, you know, southwest London, where Ed Davey holds his own seat, for whom, you know, their Conservative support is soft. And it's partly soft because the Conservatives have gone chasing after votes in the north and have gone for a more culturally conservative approach. So there's this then choice for the Liberal Democrats. Do you pursue this, the radical agenda of radical redistribution, urgent kind of climate emergency overhaul of absolutely everything you look at? Or do you go for a socially conservative, more affluent, environmental kind of vote in those traditionally Tory shires? It's quite hard to be both of those things at the same time with a sort of Corbynite-style policy agenda that you're selling to the wealthy, more old, elderly even, voters of Chesham and Amersham and other constituencies. They might be able to do it, you know, but it's not necessarily easy for them to chase that wealthy vote when they think of themselves as the radical anti-poverty party.
Let's quickly move on to the Yorkshire Post, and they're reporting on a report by Sheffield academics in which the government, they're saying the government's current policies to tackle regional inequalities offer funding that mostly isn't new, is often short-term and looks likely to be scattered widely across the country. Alex?
Well, the Conservative Party plainly has to live up to the promise it made to voters in the North when our Prime Minister memorably asked them to lend him their vote, and in seat after seat they did. But I do think there's a connection between these two areas of conversation, obviously, between the hitherto regarded as safe Conservative seats in the South, which some now allege have been taken for granted, and the new seats in the North, which the Conservative Party has made real inroads in. And one of the connections that we haven't discussed yet is the quality of campaigning, because it is obvious in the North that some of the gains have been made, not just in MP seats, but in mayoral seats too, like Ben Houchen's, that some of the gains have been made by just really good campaigning, by people who are super effective on the ground and running good campaigns and knocking on doors well and with good, effective messages. And to be clear, one possibility out of Chesham and Amersham is that the Lib Dems just campaigned better than the Tories, is that they were there in bigger numbers, is that they were there more persuasively, they were there for longer every day. And I was there for a couple of days doing my bit, and it was obvious that the Lib Dems had swamped that seat, had been up and down it and knocking on every door and leafleting everybody with the kinds of news that they wanted to hear. Well, it may just be that the Tories have been better at campaigning in the North of late, and the Lib Dems have been a bit better in campaigning in leafy, hitherto Tory seats. OK, Alex and Polly, for the moment, thank you. Do stay with us. Much more coming up shortly.
I witnessed how the Catalan fight for independence split families. It was from this chamber that Carles Puigdemont declared independence in October.
I come here because I want to show other people what happened.
I'm Michelle Clifford and I'm Sky's Europe correspondent. It's not the aim of the smugglers to actually get people to UK shores, but simply into British waters. We aim to be the best, and most trusted place for news. There are real concerns here now about whether the health system will be able to cope. President Macron has spoken in defence of freedom of expression, saying France won't give up its caricatures and drawings made by people who dare to challenge. Afternoon, Mr. Barnier. How are you?
I have no time for any polemics.
There's anger at the police, anger at the government, anger about wider social and economic problems in this nation.
We're on the verge of fascism and we have a country to save.
I'm Adam Parsons. I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
Dan usaha saya menggarap lahan hutan.
Hello, or like we say in my language, Zole. I am Tonti, the founder and the CEO of Renewables in Africa. This picture changed my whole career and my whole life. My mission is simple, is to bring back power to Africa. And our vision is to turn the dark continent that I saw in 2008 into a brighter and prosperous one by 2040.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me, Polly Mackenzie, Chief Executive of the Demos think tank, and PR Consultant Alex Deane. Welcome back to both of you. And I said earlier that we were waiting for papers to come in because of the football. They are coming in gradually. So let's start with one that's covering the football, and that's the Sun. England and Scotland can't be separated. Was it an anticlimax for either of you? Alex, start with you first of all.
Oh, look, whenever one expresses an opinion, you'll immediately be asked on social media, could you do any better? So for the avoidance of doubt, no, I couldn't. But God, it was dull as ditch water. And the last 10 minutes, it just felt like it felt like agony watching, English hopes, high hopes sort of dissipate into flaccid inactivity. But I think this is a brilliant headline. England and Scotland can't be separated. We've got which is what you say when someone gets a draw, but also a very smart line about the union. Bravo, the Sun. I don't know if they had much time to think about it because nobody expected it to be a draw, but great headline.
Polly, what did you make of it? Did you see any of the game?
Yeah, I watched it with my kids for the first time. They stayed up late. My 7-year-old son just kept saying, what's the score? What's the score? Are we there yet? I just couldn't understand why it was still 0-0. He's like, they've been playing for 73 minutes and no one scored. So, yeah, I think I've sort of had something of his sense of torpor and boredom, but I did eat a lot of crisps, so, okay. There was ups.
There's always an upside, isn't there? Very quickly, let's just finish off on this story in the FT, and this is Brussels losing out on this battle with AstraZeneca. We've not got much time left, but just run us through. Alex.
So remarkably, Brussels thought it would be a smart idea to try to go to law against AstraZeneca, one of the companies that's just delivered us a vaccine to save millions of lives. I'm sure somewhere in the network there are clients somewhere of businesses that I do business with. So declaration, I'm sure there's some, although I don't work with them, someone will. But my God, it's still, even from my perspective, felt like that episode where it's one Nazi turns to another and says, "Are we the baddies?" And what do they think they were doing, suing AstraZeneca on a basis of a contract that said we'll do our best endeavours to get vaccines to you? Well, lo and behold, they got their bottoms handed to them in court. They should think very carefully about doing it again. It seemed to me to be an act of desperation from the EU, unwilling to admit that they'd negotiated very badly over contracts for vaccines. They instead resorted to lashing out. Well, as bullies often find out, it didn't work out.
Oh, harsh words. Alex and Polly, for the moment, thank you. Much more coming up at 11. For the meantime, thank you very much.